All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. So today we're going to be talking about managing ADHD and like what does ADHD look like and kind of getting a sense of what that looks like as an adult specifically. I think that there is a lot of conversation out there about what it looks like for youth and things. I've also heard a lot of people say that like ADHD is trending right now and everybody has ADHD. So we're going to talk a little bit about that piece too, because I think it's important to talk about that. I think having a thorough understanding of it is important, but that also comes with the idea that there's stigma attached to this particular diagnosis. And so I do have some thoughts about that. If we have some time, we'll talk about that. But there is some stigma attached to it in terms of capacity and just like whether or not it's even like a real diagnosis. But we'll talk a little bit about what that definition is, what that looks like, and kind of how to work through that today. So just by quick overview, I'll just kind of give you guys a rundown on what we're going to go over. So first, just like who is this presentation for and why does it even matter? So my intentions for this presentation are that this will help not only those with ADHD, but anyone who has a coworker, an employee, or even just like a loved one who has ADHD. Understanding kind of how they tick is important. So it can be a really helpful and supportive way for you to know more about ADHD. So even if you don't have anyone in your life with ADHD and you're interested, this is the place for you. So hopefully you can get something out of it as well. And then we're going to talk about, so what do I need to know about ADHD? And what are some of those things to help us decrease the stigma, increase connection between those that we are with, build empathy, lower that shame, because there's a lot of shame surrounding some of the things that come with ADHD. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to manage the symptoms. We're going to talk specifically about time, motivation, and awareness, and then we'll kind of cover some things within those categories. And we'll go through some resources as well. A lot of the information from today's presentation, not all of it, but a good chunk of it comes from Dr. Ari Tuckman. He is one of the leading researchers in ADHD, has done just tons of research, written books, and just knows a lot about the topic. So a lot of the like resources are directly through him, and I'll give you his website at the end. So just so you kind of know where this is coming from, this is not just like ADHD according to Beth, but this is based on a lot of Dr. Ari Tuckman's research and his information. So let's talk about some definitions because this is an important place to start. What is ADHD? What does that stand for? Stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I think most people know that. When it used to be like that there was ADHD and ADD, but now we just say ADHD and then we base it off the type. So it would be like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, um, hyperactive type, or inattentive type, or combined type. And that's an important thing to note is that ADD is no longer like an accurate term in psychology. I often hear the phrase, and this is where I want to start talking a little bit about some of those biases that come with this particular one. Everyone has a little ADHD. Um, and so I want you to keep that in mind as we're talking about what ADHD really is and how it really presents and shows up. Because I hear this phrase a lot. And what I will tell you is that for those who are struggling with the symptoms of ADHD or trying to navigate it and figure it out, it's actually a fairly invalidating thing to say. Like, yeah, everyone gets distracted every once in a while, but I think that's just a phrase I want you to be thoughtful about, being cautious in how you use it. So just keep that in mind as we talk about all that. Okay, so why do I even care about this topic and who am I? So, by way of introduction, so my name is Beth. I'm a therapist with Blomquist and Hale. I have been a social worker for almost 20 years, and I have been dealing with ADHD for 42. So, I wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult, and getting that diagnosis literally changed a lot of things about myself. But it we'll talk a little bit more about that, how that all came about as we go through these things. But um, it kind of put me on a path to really learn a lot more about what ADHD was because, when I got that diagnosis, I didn't really understand it. But I was already working with like teenagers and things who have those symptoms. And so this has been a really cool journey to be a part of. The reason I feel like it's important for me to tell you that is because a lot of the examples I'm going to use, I feel like it's really good to know where those things are coming from and whether or not it works. So I'm going to use a lot of examples of things I've tried and not tried and or things that have worked and not worked and kind of just help make it a little bit more relatable. So that's why I think that's important. Um, but this is also just something that I think is good to know. So this statement I think is a helpful just kind of summary of a lot of what we're going to talk about. ADHD is not a disorder of knowing what to do, it's a disorder of doing what you know. So we'll talk through a lot of that today too. Okay, so let's start with time. Time is one of those things for a person with ADHD that can just be really elusive. So either we lose track of time or that time just seems like it's taking forever, or if we're bored or excited or whatever, like the emotions kind of impact that time too. So time is one of those things that's a little bit tricky. And knowing how much time we have for something is another thing that's really hard for people with ADHD. So this is another quote from Dr. Tuckman. By the time you feel it, it's probably too late. So that's something that like a lot of people with ADHD really struggle with. I have this thing that's coming up. I know it's due on Thursday. I know I've got to work on it before Thursday. I know it's something that needs to be done. And I'm going to get to it. It's on my brain. I'm thinking about it all the time. I'm going to get to it. But by the time it feels like there's enough pressure to actually sit down and do it, it's probably Thursday afternoon and it's due that evening. And so there's a lot of present experience and not enough understanding of like what's coming in the future. So like what does the future look like? So there's a delayed response and feeling that pressure. And there's two times that exists for a person with ADHD, now and not now. And so understanding like what not now looks like is a lot more difficult. One of the reasons that time is hard is because understanding how much time is passing or how much time is left requires a lot of attention. And our memory is only as good as our attention in that moment. So, yeah, you might be hearing something like a lecture in a class or a conversation with a boss, but if there's no memory of it, and because we're not being attentive, then we're not going to be as effective. So that's why doing things like taking notes in like meetings and things like that is really helpful. Something that I hear a lot is like, well, why are you taking notes if you're not ever going to go back and read them, or you're just going to lose the notes? So why would I bother writing them down? A lot of times that process of actually taking the notes is more about just helping you pay attention so that memory is stored, because it's only as a good at your memory is only as good as your attention. So being present in that moment and attentive helps you remember what's being discussed and talked about. So yes, you might have 15 notebooks lying around that you're using like here and there, and that's fine. Um, it's more about just the process of actually writing it down. Maybe you have a note in your phone where you keep that information, or like a documentation place on your computer, whatever that looks like. But just using those tools to help you kind of stay focused in the present moment helps your memory and your attention in those moments as you're trying to keep track of the time too. Okay, so more about time. Feeling the future is difficult, and so we have to be able to find ways to like build that in, right? But the problem is that natural consequences don't always sink in, because sometimes natural consequences take a while to kick in, right? Because it doesn't stick or it doesn't translate. Like, okay, so yeah, last Thursday I had this deadline and I was working all the way up until the last minute, and it was a scramble, it was stressful, it was overwhelming, and like I can't believe I did that again. But next week's Thursday me, who has a similar deadline, probably isn't going to be thinking about last week's Thursday me. So those natural consequences don't always stick. So in order to help with building in consequences for like keeping track of time and knowing how to feel the future, we need to be looking at certain types of consequences. So these four categories are just a helpful way to think about it. So first, immediate consequences. So that would be things like, okay, I am not allowed to have a snack until I finish typing this paragraph or putting in my notes on this thing or doing this one thing, or I can't have the chocolate that I bought for myself until the dishes are done. So that's like an immediate consequence because you're delaying your gratification on that thing by accomplishing the task, which is going to help build that ability to stay focused in some ways. Um, frequency. That might look like at work, having more frequent check-ins with your supervisor because, I've had projects given to me before, like, I don't know, we need to have this done like mid-May. That's not going to work. We have to be able to have something a little bit more frequent and a more consistent and more, we'll talk more about deadlines too in just a minute, but it might be like, okay, so it's due mid-May. Let's say it's due May 15th. Um, we're going to check in on this date, and this date. And you may have to communicate that to the person that you're working with. Okay, in order to get this done, I need to have this done in chunks. So I'm going to do this in chunks, and we're going to need to do check-ins on these days. Because then you're frequently being held accountable and having to think about that future deadline for the project. So that's why, like in college classes, when they're like, okay, we need a first draft and a second draft on this paper, that's something that's actually really helpful for a person with ADHD to be able to have that accountability more frequently. Um, Externalizing consequences is another way to do that. All right, if I'm late for the meeting next week, I've been late for the last 2 weeks. If I'm late again next week, I have to buy you lunch. Or, I have to, if I'm late getting home from work because I got distracted doing something, then I'll do the dishes for a week, right? That just kind of helps externalize that accountability too, give some other people some place to do that. And maybe we don't want to buy lunch for that coworker or that person or whatever. And maybe dishes is the least favorite thing at the house. So if that's the case, then we have that motivation built in because we know kind of what to expect. So externalizing those consequences is good. And then consistency is always really critical when it comes to ADHD. Um, so the best example I can give you with this one when it comes to like helping yourself feel that future. So I had a job a couple years ago that there was a lot of paperwork involved, but the deadlines were kind of wishy-washy. There was never really like a real clear cut. This is when it has to be done. And so because the job was really busy and there was a lot of things going on all the time, my paperwork frequently got behind. And so I'd have to, spend days catching up or spend a day here and there catching up. And I probably dropped a few things here and there as well, but for the most part, like it just was like a pretty overwhelming and daunting task. However, in the job I'm in now at Blomquist, the requirement is that all my documentation is in at the end of the day. When I first heard that expectation, my first thought was, I am going to be terrible at this job. Well, it turns out that that's actually really helpful for me because my boss gets a little notification. Well, like, there's like a notification in the system if I miss a note. Goes into the system and there's like a reminder. So the next day I get a reminder and my boss sees that too. That's not something I want in my life. And so this job has been really good for me in that way because there's a very consistent deadline. I know exactly what that expectation is, and it's reasonable. It's been doable. So I haven't gone behind. So that's just an example kind of what that can look like. Okay. A lot of times when we're looking at the future and time for a person with ADHD, we think about those situations where there's just like totally zoned in on something, right? So that hyper focus, which is something that happens with people with ADHD, is that ability to just like really zone in on something. That is like having a loss of awareness of that time. Okay. I got distracted doing this thing because I was really excited or happy about it. I hear a lot from people. They're like, oh yeah, I got in trouble for doing this thing when I was a kid because I just would like start playing and I would get lost. Or, I missed my exit because I was just so focused on listening to the book I was listening to or the podcast I was listening to. Um, for me personally, like if I sit down with like an actual paper book, this is what happens to me. And so I don't read paper books very often. I do a lot of audiobooks. So I can do that while I do other tasks. But if I sit down to read a book, I'm gonna probably get lost in that book. My mom used to take my books away from me when I was a kid, because I'd stay up and just read because that's something that I really enjoy. Um, okay, so now what do we do with all of this? So the skill that kind of comes along with that is pause and picture. So I'm gonna just take a step back from the situation before I decide like what is the next step on something. And I'm gonna ask myself, if I do this now, how will I feel about it? And I'm going to avoid asking myself, do I want to do this? Because the answer is probably no, especially if it's a task that is not immediately appealing. Okay. So pausing and picturing that future self is a pretty critical part of that. Okay, before we move to the next one, I'm going to look at there's some things in the chat. I just want to read through real quick and see if it's something we need to read out loud. Um, so one comment, oh, hold on, I'm going to scroll back up. One comment, if I talk about the future, people think I'm being controlling or worrying about something that isn't now. I need to know where this ship is going, and I want to make sure it's not being steered into an iceberg, so I have the option to get off. Love that. Yes. I think talking about the future is critical. And with ADHD, it's actually a pretty good thing to do. Like, okay, so if this is what we're doing right now, what's that going to look like in the future? So that's something that I think is actually pretty great. And then another comment, I thought I was the only person in the world who got grounded from books when I was a kid. Nope. Hi. Me too. And apparently we have others as well. So yeah, no, yeah, they were frequently taken away from me. Um, Let's see. And then another comment, I will let tasks that affect me get behind, but feel bad when I allow tasks that affect others. Yes, that is very common as well. So I actually imagine myself as two people, my current self and my future self. I'll motivate myself to perform a task that I really do not want to do because I will make my future self happy once that task is complete. Game changer. Yes, I love that. Thank you for that comment. And then how do we balance hyper focus? I feel like I get the most done at work when I'm in hyper focus mode. Okay, I'm really glad you asked that question. Thank you. Hyper focus isn't always bad. So when we're looking at a situation, hyperfocus can actually be kind of a superpower in a lot of ways. Because once we get like started on a project, if you're able to kind of get into a groove with that hyperfocus and you're doing well and you're getting stuff done, then you're not stressed about how much time it's taking. And that's actually the beauty of that hyperfocus because I can do this task and I can get into a groove with it and be like chugging along and just getting it done and feeling really good about it and then realize, oh man, like it's lunchtime. This is great. And I got all this work done because I got into that mode, right? It's actually getting to a space of hyper focus that's harder. But if you are in that place and you're able to like, you have like a way that you can get your brain into that place with work, then I would say that's great. Like hyper focus is not a bad thing. None of these things are necessarily good or bad. It's just a matter of understanding what it means. So when I'm in a space of hyper focus, I'm probably not paying attention to the time. So if I have a specific task at work that I typically have to get into a hyper focus to do, I probably don't want to start that task 15 minutes before a meeting or something like that. So we're actually going to talk about that piece a little bit as well too. And then some other comments. Hyperfocus is the main way I get anything done at work. Yes. I do not know how to do this for anything enjoyable though. That's a little bit harder. And we actually are going to talk about that too. So sometimes I say, okay, not sure how I just got muted. Sorry. Um, okay. So we're kind of jumping into some stuff in the chat that I think is really helpful. So watch the chat because there's some really great comments in there as well.
Hey Beth.
Okay.
Hey Beth.
So
I had a
yes.
question come through to me directly.
Yeah, of course.
So it was, I was a high functioning talkative student who often felt bored in school. It wasn't until the last 15 years that I realized I have ADHD. Now, as I go through menopause, my ADHD symptoms seem to have intensified. Do you have any suggestions for managing ADHD during menopause?
Yes, that is going to be that would have to be a completely separate webinar, I think. I think that what we're going to be talking about these next couple of slides actually will help a lot with that, though. I think having some real basic um, tools and skills is applicable across the board. But if that's something that people are interested in, we would have to do like a separate training specifically for menopause and like what that looks like, because that is absolutely something that I'm hearing. I've heard it from clients directly, from family members. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because that's something that we can definitely talk about. I think what we're going to cover next should be applicable to that. So hopefully it is. We'll see. So hold on, there was a question back here that I missed though. Um, okay, so we had a question about feeling overwhelmed in our minds. We are going to talk about that. So hang tight and we will get to that. Okay, so first, when we're talking about navigating this whole ADHD thing, we have to understand the difference between awareness and motivation. So we have to create awareness of the time, awareness of the situation, awareness of what's going on around us, right? And if we can have that awareness first, that's how we can kind of start to be, in tune with it. The awareness is one of those things that I think most people are trying to like navigate and really push. So I think most of the suggestions out there are actually going to cover this piece of it. So creating awareness of what's going on. Here's the problem though, like we have to look at both of these things. So let's first look at motivation, or sorry, awareness. So clocks are important. If you have a watch, that's great. Um, Probably every single person in this room or in this training has their phone on them most of the time. Here's what I'm going to tell you about having a phone. Phones are great. They're also very distracting. I don't know how many of you have had this experience, but I know several people who have told me that this is a shared experience for them too. You pick up your phone to look at your time, realize you have a text message, and now suddenly you're on Instagram watching Reels for 20 minutes, like I don't know, or TikTok or Facebook, or even just reading an email that you didn't actually have time to respond to right now, but because you picked your phone up to see the time and you saw that that email had come through, now suddenly you're distracted, right? So my recommendation for that is clocks, like actually having clocks in your spaces wherever you can, or a watch where you can check the time without as many distractions. Phones are good. I'm not saying they're bad. If it's not a distraction for you and that's not a problem for you to like check the time on your phone, that's good. The other reason the clocks are good is because I don't have to pick up a clock to look at the time. It's just right there and I can check that time and pay attention to it. Timers are also good, creates that awareness and notifications like in your phone. If you already are motivated to do something and you just need to remember to do it, those things are great tools, okay? But then if you're maybe not as motivated, let's figure out like, okay, so how do I create that motivation? This is an acronym that you can actually just Google and find all kinds of information on. I've seen it INCUP or NICU. It just depends on how you look at it. Essentially, it stands for interesting, new, challenging or creative, urgent, and passionate. So these are those things that, like, if I can create one of those five things, I'm going to be way more motivated to do the thing that needs to be done. So if I know there's a deadline and I feel urgency to do it, I'm going to have that motivation to do that thing. Okay, so these five things are things that like can help with that. So if it's something you're passionate about, you're going to be more likely to want to do it. If there's a challenge in it, of course, you're going to be more likely to want to do it. So, whoever gets this done first, gets to choose where we go to dinner or whatever that looks like. Um, in my house, it would be whoever gets this done first wouldn't have to choose where to go to dinner. Sometimes I hate that decision. Okay. Um, and then finding some external motivation. Um, so things that like are also like helping you find that motivation. And we're going to talk about some examples on that in just a second. And then this is one that is less research based and more just experience based from people that I've talked to who experienced this. But body doubling is something that for a person with ADHD can be really helpful. So what is body doubling? Essentially, I know I need to get some work done, and you know you need to get some work done. So let's sit in the same space and hold each other accountable. Or I need to get the laundry folded and put away. So if you come and sit in the room with me while I do that, I'm going to be way more likely to just stay focused and get it done. I'm not entirely sure why it works. And I've tried to find any research on like why it would work or anything that kind of supports it. I just know it does. Like there's so many people that I've talked to about this thing. I have a sister with ADHD. I spoke with her about this particular phenomenon, and she has a coworker that will call her and just say like, "Hey, I know you've got this thing, and I'm not really doing anything right now. So let's jump on a Zoom call and we'll just work together." They're not working on the same project, but like that's something that she said she really appreciates because this coworker knows like, "Hey, you need to be able to find the time to do it, and you're more likely to if we're just working together." So that's something that's really helpful. During the pandemic, there was actually whole groups on Zoom of people that would just like unrelated jobs jump into these Zoom calls and just work and have each other there as like accountability buddies, essentially. Okay, so let's talk about the difference. We have to be able to come to a place where we know which one is it that we're struggling with. So if you're struggling to complete a task or to follow through with something or to stay consistent on something, ask yourself first, Am I lacking awareness in the time and what it takes to do what I need to do? Or am I lacking motivation? You got to ask yourself that question before you can kind of really determine how to intervene. Because if you're lacking awareness, that intervention is going to look very different than if you're lacking motivation. So here is just a brief example of like what that can look like. So for me, and actually this is something that is really common amongst people who struggle with ADHD. Um, Going to bed is boring. So it's not something I ever really feel motivated to do. Not only that, but I have a tendency to get like a cleaning bug at 11:30 at night. Like suddenly I want to clean the house, and that's very inconvenient. I also need sleep. Sleep is so critical for any kind of health and mental health issue. So I'm not even going to say that that's even ADHD specific. Like sleep is just important for our overall well-being. So staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning cleaning on a Tuesday evening is not a good play, period. Like not for most situations, right? So my husband's super techie. He set up our like sitting room, living room, kitchen area to be on like smart switches and stuff. And at midnight, all of the lights in that area go off, and our under cabinet lights in our kitchen turn red. That's like, hello, it is midnight. Why are you still down here? It's time to go to bed. It's time to get out of this space. It's time to go get ready for sleep for the night. Um, and like at first, like it was really helpful, like, oh crap, it's midnight. I better just like head to bed. It's great. So it worked for a little while, but it stopped working because I just got really good at ignoring the red or like walking back over to the motion sensors and like they would just turn back to like the normal color or like, hey Alexa, turn the lights back on. Like, I just got really good at ignoring it and thinking like, okay, now I know it's midnight, so at least I know what time it is. And I'd turn the lights back on and just keep doing what I was doing, and it didn't change anything because there was no motivation at that point. It was just awareness. Okay. So one example of building both is, and Dr. Tuckman tells this story. He had a friend who was struggling with that same thing, and similar thing, like the lights would turn off at a certain point, and he said that he just got really good at working in the dark. And um, but instead, what he did was he took an alarm clock and set it for a specific time and put it in his baby's room. And so at 5 minutes before that alarm went off, the lights would turn off. So that brought awareness to the time. And then he knew he had 5 minutes to make it into that baby's room to turn off that alarm before it would wake up the whole house. Because, baby wakes up, it's going to wake everybody up. So that created the motivation. Some of these things might seem kind of juvenile or silly or whatever, or maybe even a little over the top and ridiculous, but sometimes that's what we need to do. And there's no judgment for that or shame that should be attached to that. But oftentimes we do shame ourselves. Like, why can I not just go to bed? Why am I not just like getting myself in bed? It's because we lack that motivation at times, right? Bed is boring. And ADHD is an executive functioning disorder, and when our brains aren't motivated or excited about something, it's a lot harder to do things. And that's applicable across the board. And so just thinking about it in those terms, like, okay, what do I need to do to gain that motivation? What do I need to do to bring awareness to this? Okay, so hopefully that's all making sense. Okay, so now we got to talk about creating a schedule. So now we have some awareness and some motivation, but what do I do? Like, how do I keep track of everything? And I think this goes to the question that was in the chat. Like, okay, so I'm feeling really overwhelmed with so many tasks in my mind. What do I do with all of this? A problem with ADHD is oftentimes it leads to overcommitment because either there's a fear of letting people down, which I think was also mentioned in the chat. Like, I don't want to let other people down. So if I say no to this thing, they're going to see that I'm incapable, or they're going to think that I'm not capable, or something like that can happen, right? But I also think too that when we have these tasks that we're trying to do, I think sometimes we're just overly ambitious about what we're taking on because we don't think about the future. Like if we're not thinking about the future and we're not thinking about how much time it's going to take to do a certain task, then of course we're not going to be thinking about how much is reasonable for me to say yes to. So here's some suggestions for that. When you're trying to create a schedule, just choose one. Choose one and stick to it, whatever that looks like, whether that's digital, whether that's handwritten, whether that's, Google Calendar or your iPhone calendar or the calendar on your other phones or whatever that looks like. There's lots of different ways to do that. If you have to buy a planner every year and write it out, that's great. Here's what I'll tell you about that. The most important thing with it isn't whether or not other people think that that system is a good system. It's whether or not you're using it. So be consistent. Are you looking at that calendar regularly? Are you consistently using the same system? Try different things out. If something's not working, shift because there's probably a reason that that particular schedule is not working for you. If it's because you're not being consistent with it, then you've got to build in like really specific times that you're going to check it. Every morning before I leave for the day, I'm going to check my calendar. Because when you do that, then you're frequently looking at the calendar. You know what's coming up. You know what you have on your plate. You can see those things a little bit better and differently. Okay. And so if you can have that all in one place where it's all accessible, then that's going to really help you be able to kind of navigate that and get used to it. So the other thing that I would recommend too is adding notes to it. So let's say you have a birthday party coming up with some friends, and you know you need to be there at 7 o'clock. So you put in the invitation that you need to leave at 6 o'clock because, or in your calendar event that you need to leave by 6. So in the note section of that little calendar event, or just like handwritten next to it, put the address where this party is taking place. Put the time that you need to arrive versus the time that you needed to leave. Um, I've had a lot of people struggle with like, okay, I'm gonna put in I'm gonna put this on my calendar at 3 o'clock because I know I need to be there by 3:30. So then I'm building in travel time, but then they forget that they built in the travel time. So then they actually end up leaving at 2:30, which then affects the rest of their day. And so they end up here 30 minutes early. And then they're like, okay, so next time I'm not going to do that. But then the next time they assume that they built in the travel time. And so they don't actually leave until the starting of the session. And then they get here 15 minutes late and then feel guilty and bad about it because they weren't consistent in the way that they were putting that in the calendar. If you're building travel time into the calendar event itself, make a note for yourself that that's what you're doing, just so you know, and you can be consistent about that. I have been guilty of those things too. So like I said, no shade to anyone because I've definitely done that too. Okay, so just it's all about get that consistency and trying what works for you. Um, Scheduling your to-do items is a pretty critical piece with this too. Here's what I will tell you. If you can do that and plug those into your schedule right from the get-go, you're going to be less likely to overwhelm yourself and say yes and overcommit to things because you can see the reality of what needs to get done. Probably still going to overcommit on some levels, but that's okay. At least you're mitigating it in some ways, right? Um, so then those random tasks that do kind of like swirl around in our minds. So this was kind of the question in the chat, right? They have a home. They have a place where they go. So they don't have to live in here all the time because now they have a place where like I'm tracking it. I know there's a lot of mental load that comes with like managing and navigating an adult life. It's not the same as when you were a kid and somebody else was tracking your schedule most of the time, or it was just like, I don't know, I go to school and they tell me where to go. It's different. And so you're not only tracking your own life, but a lot of times the life of your family, like your kids and or your partner or spouse or whatever, right? There's other people involved as well. So it can be a lot. So the first thing to do is just get good at putting those, having a home for those tasks. Okay, when I need to get that done, this is when I'm gonna do that. Okay. It prevents that overcommitment from happening. And the thing to remember too is that some of these tasks may not have like specific deadlines, but the thing to get to practice is I'm going to move this task to another location rather than just moving over and remembering I didn't do that thing. Because once yesterday is gone, it's yesterday, and I'm not going to go back and think about it again. So if I that thing on my calendar from yesterday didn't get done, I need to move it to tomorrow so that I remember that it still needs to be done. Because then again, I'm being realistic about what's on my plate. And that just again helps us kind of do that. So instead of deleting it from our calendar and then just like, oh, I'll figure it out later, or just leaving it on the calendar, we're going to move it to a new location. Okay. Um, so that's kind of how we can use that scheduling to help us stay on track with like the time and the awareness and all that stuff. Okay, so here's a term that I think can be really helpful as well when looking at, okay, how do I navigate all these tasks? I have this task list, I have this calendar, and I've got to kind of fill in a few of these things here and there, right? So our days usually aren't like 100% booked. And there's like moments here and there where we can maybe like respond to an email or things like that. Knowing ahead of time what tasks for you are sticky tasks versus slippery tasks is a critical part of navigating those moments. And here's why. So, a sticky task is something that are like those things that if you start it, you're probably not going to put it down. So, like the reading for me when I was a kid, right? Or some people have like a certain game that they play on their phone. If they start that game, they're probably not going to put it down. Or, doom scrolling on social media, whatever that looks like. If those are sticky tasks, then those are not the ones that you want to be doing when you're in a position where you only have a few minutes and you're just kind of giving yourself a mental break. Okay. Is it always inappropriate? No, not necessarily, because some sticky tasks are appropriate. Like I actually really love learning and reading. It's a good thing. I just have to figure out how do I do that in a way that is not going to create problems. Okay. And then slippery tasks are those ones that like we just have a hard time holding on to and we don't really want to do them in the first place. Because those are not the fun ones, the ones that we just don't really enjoy. So like a slippery task might be paperwork. It might be things that like typically you don't want to do. Um, but identifying which ones are which, like which sticky tasks do you tend to go to, that distract you the most often. And then with the slippery tasks, the thing I want you to think about is that a lot of times we look busy, but what we're actually doing is just avoiding. So procrastination can look like busyness when we're choosing tasks that are maybe the sticky tasks or just really easy, like low mental load tasks, and we're avoiding something else. So it's not that we are folding laundry, it's that we're not writing that report. So asking ourselves, okay, am I doing this thing or am I not doing that thing? So I know that's a complicated way to think about it, but if I'm folding the laundry, is it because I'm trying to avoid something else? Um, because that's kind of a low thing. The other example with that I think is a really good one is emails. It's really easy to sit down at your desk and not think too much about what you need to get done that day. Just get started on responding to emails, and that will just suck in a lot of your time. So, doing that, being and paying attention to that is important as well. Then we need to prepare our environment, make sure that we're decreasing distractions and that we're trying to figure out what are those off ramps that usually pull us in different directions and how can I avoid that. We all tell ourselves lies like I don't need to write it down, I'll remember it, it's fine. And so like getting ourselves to a place where like we are consistent with ourselves about what those things are is an important piece of that too. Okay. All right, I have more material than I realized I did. So, okay, let's talk about deadlines really quick, and then I'm gonna probably get us pretty close to wrapping up so we can answer some questions and talk about some other things. Um, Deadlines. Set hard deadlines. So I don't know, next week sometime is not a sufficient deadline because if you tell a person with ADHD, I don't know, next week sometime, you'll get it Friday afternoon. That's like probably pretty like, or if Thursday is their last day of work that day, you'll get it Thursday afternoon. Okay. With deadlines, I recommend being really clear with the person that you're working with. And that's where that ambiguity, clarifying that ambiguity comes in too, is okay, you need this by Monday afternoon, but you're probably going to want to review it before it's fully submitted and see it. And if that's the case, I probably don't want to be turning it in right away. So yes, it's going to be presented on that day at this time, but it needs to be reviewed. So the actual deadline is Thursday at noon. Okay. And we establish that, figure that out, have those conversations. Wednesday rolls around and it's like, there's absolutely no way. This fire came up at work this week and I'm going to need until Friday afternoon. That's where that it's Tuesday and you're already realizing you're going to need one more day on this project. communicate upfront, communicate clearly. Um, Disappoint early is a way to think about that. Like, okay, most people have those things come up. That has nothing to do with ADHD, because everyone has fires that happen and things that move or have to move around and deadlines that have to be flexible, right? But oftentimes with ADHD, it's this belief that like, oh, I got it, it's fine, or that fear of being seen as incapable. But then what we do is it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I didn't communicate that ahead of time because of the shame I felt about the fact that it wasn't done. And now it's really not done. And I'm having to disappoint this person last minute rather than giving them a heads up on Tuesday when I already knew it was probably not going to be done on time. So clarifying that ambiguity helps with some of that like emotional space as well. Okay. Um, this is one that I think is also pretty critical. There were some questions on in the chat about this too, and some comments. There is a huge emotional impact that comes with having ADHD and being around ADHD. There's so much guilt and shame about like not accomplishing tasks, making and that all just makes it so much harder. I didn't get that done. I forgot that thing again. I left my keys in the car again. Let's not talk about how many times I've done that in my lifetime. Um, a fair few, and maybe once or twice with the car actually running. But if I'm out of routine and like not like right in that space, like it just happens. My brain doesn't like think the same way, and so things like that happen. But there's so much shame related to that. And that shame just makes everything so much more difficult. That's where a lot of anxiety comes from with people who struggle with ADHD. Anxiety and depression are very, very common comorbid diagnoses, because of the like mental strain that it can have. And sometimes they just co-occur. So we have to take time to relax and recharge. It's not about avoiding. So yeah, we're going to avoid sometimes, but then like there's always that like little bit of guilt, like, oh, I'm just doing this to avoid doing that. No, sometimes it really is just necessary to relax and set those limits with like this is what I can do, and it's okay to say no. And the more you're aware of what's on your schedule and what you need and that relaxation time that's also needed, the better you can get at setting those limits. Like that's actually not a project I can take on right now. Sounds great and exciting and I would love to be involved, but I don't have capacity in my schedule until next week or the following week or maybe next time you guys work on this, I'll jump in, but this time I don't have time, right? Um, Things along those lines. That might be how it looks at work and at home. It might just be like, I recognize that like that there's still piles of stuff in my house that probably should be sorted. And right now I just need to take a break. The weather's amazing today. I'm gonna go to the park and I'm not gonna feel guilty about it because that's what my body needs and that's what my mind needs in order to reset and recharge. Um, ADHD is not all of who you are. There's so many things about you as an individual that are amazing. And some of it is probably created from that space because ADHD exists in our brains and our brains create who we are, right? But it's not all of who you are. There are many parts of you. So remembering that like that's not the only thing that people see is that little bit of like occasional forgetfulness or distractedness or like hyper focus, whatever that looks like. Um, the other piece of emotional impact that I think is really good to know about ADHD is oftentimes people with ADHD are verbal processors. And so if they're stuck on a task, or they're feeling really overwhelmed and frustrated, asking them like, hey, tell me what's going on in your head right now, and just give them time to just vomit all of their thoughts. Okay. Actually did hear a really interesting thing on social media that was like some people are think to talkers and some people are talk to thinkers. And I thought that was super duper interesting. I wish I could remember who said it or where I heard that, but like it's just a really good way to think about it. Like some people internally process and then want to talk about it, and other people verbally process and then want to talk about it. And a lot of times people with ADHD are verbal processors. So they may want to talk about it right away. And there's some relationship implications there. But again, that would probably have to be a whole separate podcast or a webinar. So yeah, so there's some big things there. So what questions do you have? I'm going to just really quickly throw this resources page up here. That's the link for Dr. Tuckman's stuff. And then I'm just going to give a brief caution on social media. Not every account that labels themselves as ADHD is actually giving factual and accurate information. Please do not only get your information on ADHD from social media and those kinds of things. There are podcasts out there that you can find. Dr. Tuckman has a lot of really great information. Go talk to your doctor if you're curious about it, or a therapist, and we can kind of help with that. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm shooting for having this much time left. So hopefully that gives us enough time. A couple questions I have is, so do you have clarifications that you want from today? Or do you also have like future trainings that you would like to see us do on ADHD? I've added the like impacts of like physical and menopause to that list. But you can throw it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and we'll do questions. And oh, I am not totally
Can
watching.
you go back to the slide that had that link?
Yes, I can. Great question. Okay. All right. So one of the questions was, does it make a difference to have an actual diagnosis rather than just a self-diagnosis? The biggest impact that would have is whether or not you're interested in medication. So if you want to be able to utilize the medical side of treating ADHD, which that's a whole separate thing as well, then you would need an official diagnosis. But honestly, if these tools and tricks and tips and ways of like kind of navigating your brain are working for you, and you feel pretty confident that that's probably why those are working for you, then and you don't need a diagnosis, then you don't need a diagnosis. Like I think the helpful thing for some people is like, oh, now I get it. Now I understand what's happening in my brain because yeah, that can be really validating. It's like, oh, I'm not broken. I just have ADHD. Yeah. So yeah, good question. And Heather, if you're seeing any that I'm missing, I love this. Who doesn't procrastinate the boring stuff? Yeah. Yeah, same.
Yeah, you've got
Um,
about 100 questions.
oh geez. Okay.
You have a lot, like in the everyone part. So do you want
Okay.
me to help you with those, or do you want,
Do
how do you
you
want to do that?
if you want to like maybe start, well, will you see if you could kind of like summarize a couple of them into like
Yeah,
two questions, and I'll
yeah,
I'll
give me just a
work it out.
sec. I will say a lot of people would love for you to do the ADHD and premenopause, menopause. There was
Okay.
a lot of comments on that.
Okay.
Let's see.
Um, let's see. I
Someone
there
asked, is
one.
someone said, is ADHD, you might have already said this, is ADHD something that you, so she talked about, or he, I don't know, talked about they were diagnosed as a child, took medicine for years, got off the meds to have a baby, and then got back on them. And um and they tested and decided they only had anxiety. And they asked, is ADHD something that you can grow out of?
Um, there's like a lot of mixed opinions on that one. Yes and no. There are things that like when our brains fully form, because like our brains aren't fully developed until we're like mid-20s, like early to mid-20s. So there are parts about it that become just different when we're adults versus when we're children. If you were diagnosed with ADHD as a child and then told as an adult that you just have anxiety, I would question that personally. Not because it isn't true, but because women who are diagnosed with ADHD later in life often are just told, oh, it's just anxiety. But hyperactivity looks different for a lot of different people, and sometimes hyperactivity actually shows up as the hyperactive like movement in our brains. And so if the ADHD medication is working for you, or like if you are like experiencing some of those same symptoms that you were when you were a kid, then it might still be ADHD. And it might be that as a kid, it was actually just anxiety, and now just anxiety. It was anxiety and not ADHD. And now, like, it's more accurately diagnosed. So it could be one of those two things. Um, but, typically, if the ADHD medications are working for someone to help them feel more focused and calm, it probably is ADHD. So It just depends on the situation, but there are parts of it that absolutely, yes, you can grow out of. Like I am much better at controlling my mouth and not just like impulsively saying the first thing that comes from my mouth. But is that because I grew out of that or because I learned that like nobody wants to hear that first thought? I don't know. Some thoughts are inside thoughts, and I had to learn that the hard way.
Okay,
So
another
cool.
one was a struggle I have is that when I forget something, my partner thinks I utilize ADHD as an excuse compared to a real reason for my forgetfulness. How can I better explain it or be better to remember their requests?
Okay, great question. So that's again where we go back to the our memory is only as good as our attention. So if they're asking you to do something right when you're in the middle of something, that's just bad timing. So they need to make sure if they're asking you to do something that you're really giving them attention when they're asking you to do it, and then you need to write it down. However that works for you. Is that a note in your phone, a reminder in your phone? Is that like a sticky note somewhere where you can see it that you're actually going to look at and not ignore? So having something like that, like it's important for them to understand, like if you are like in the middle of something and they're asking you to do something else, like your brain's probably not fully engaged with the idea that like, oh, I didn't actually process what they just asked me to do. And so, yeah, we do forget things sometimes. And it's not an excuse, it's an explanation, but we also want to be cautious not to use it as an excuse. Yeah, I still need to work at it. Like I still, like a person with anxiety still has to do things to manage that anxiety. So a person with ADHD is still going to need to do things to navigate that anxiety. And sometimes we're just not going to get it right, especially when we're trying to learn new tools and skills. So that's a really great question.
Okay, another one is what if you don't hyper focus? What if you're doing 3 to 4 things at a time? I can multitask for days, but to try and just sit and read or just focus on one item, my brain refuses.
Yeah, that's also really common. So, a way that I like to describe that is like, and this is probably not new to most of you. A person with ADHD is like a computer screen that has multiple tabs running at all times, and somewhere there's music playing, and we just don't know which tab it's on. But some YouTube page we opened up probably 25 years ago is now playing the Spice Girls. I don't know. Like Wicked soundtrack plays in my head pretty regularly. That's a really common thing for people with ADHD. Medication can help with that, to be totally honest. Like that's one of the best things about medication. It kind of quiets down that noise in our minds. Um, but I am way better at doing the laundry or the dishes if I am listening to a podcast that's interesting and exciting. Or this is something I hear a lot. And I know it's kind of a universal experience. So like I feel comfortable sharing this. It's silly, but if I'm watching a new movie, this is so bad. But like if I see someone on the screen that I'm like, I know I've seen them in a movie somewhere, and like I'll pull up IMDb and start searching for them, and suddenly I'm on a rabbit hole on IMDb just because like my brain couldn't sit through that movie, whatever that is, right? So if you need to be able to like focus your brain in on something, it's okay to just like find something that's more absorbing. Like I need a minute where I'm just doing one thing. So what's one thing that I can do that really absorbs my attention? And finding those things here and there, but multitasking isn't necessarily terrible. I did finally have someone say to me, like, I just need you to not have your phone in the room when we're watching movies. And so I just have other things I fidget with. So it really is like it's communication and clarification in those situations is good too. So yeah, it's not always bad.
Okay, and then someone said, what do I do if my employer makes me use a system that I don't like? For example, I like a real handwritten calendar. They want me to use Google Calendar.
Been there. Okay, so I worked for the state of Utah for 13 years, and I'd been there for about 6 years when they announced we're going to Google and like we're getting rid of all planners and you can't have a paper planner anymore, or at least we're not going to buy you one. I was absolutely devastated and like, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm gonna do this. It's gonna be really tricky. And it forced me to kind of do that because I tried for the first like 6 or 7 months to do both because like I was like, I need it written down, I need it written down. And what I learned was like trying to juggle both was actually worse. And so I kind of just had to force myself to I gave it a good go. I'm going to try the digital calendar for the next like 6 months. And I gave myself a deadline and I'm going to do absolutely everything I can to just be invested in this deadline. And I actually got pretty good at it. Would I prefer a paper like written calendar most of the time? Yeah, probably. But it also isn't always reasonable. So there is some like level of adapting that we have to do. Because you're going to be better off just fully engaging in the one you don't like than trying to navigate two different systems. So, because you're going to forget to write one down in one spot or the other, and it just takes a lot of time. So, hopefully that kind of clarifies that.
Okay, and then this one's probably hard to answer just quickly. But it says, any tips for parents with ADHD trying to raise and teach kids with ADHD? For some context, my wife has ADHD and homeschools our kids, one or two of which also have ADHD. Getting our kids to pay attention for less exciting topics can be tricky, which also makes it harder for my wife to focus.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a whole other webinar. Like we could talk about that for an hour. There are some things we talked about today though that I think could help, like focusing on the that like slippery versus sticky tasks and figuring that out and then creating the motivation and awareness. So yeah, natural consequences in those situations aren't going to work. So what do those consequences look like? Like what do we need to do to create it and make it fun? That in cup acronym that we talked about could also potentially be helpful. But those are just like really, really basic things that may already be implemented. And so we would have to talk about that. And that completely, anything more than that, I think would need more time. Yeah, you're right on that, Heather.
Okay, and then can you recommend a good book on ADHD, identifying tendencies, solutions,
Yeah,
resources, etc.? Yeah.
the link right there under resources. I had every intention of getting like way more resources onto this page. But it just I kind of scanning through and finding the right ones is hard. But I think that the book that Dr. Tuckman wrote is a really good one. Anything you can read up on mindfulness also is helpful because mindfulness is a really super helpful tool for people with ADHD, learning how to do that.
I know you talked about work a little bit. This one said, how do you deal with people or an organization that wants you to add weekly or daily activities to your schedule, but you are at your limit? I feel like there's a lot of guilt tripping associated with saying no to something, but the expected answer is yes because of general expectations.
Um, I think that one also, I don't even know that that's necessarily related to ADHD. I think that's just a cultural issue within the environment. And if you do have ADHD, struggling with already fitting those things in, routine, structure, schedule, consistency, that's the most I can tell you with those things. Like if you can build it in and make it really super consistent wherever possible, that's going to always help. So if you have like these three things have to be done every single day, find the time of day where you're most likely to do it, tackle those during that time frame. And then do the best you can. But sometimes systems just aren't built for that. So passionate, sorry. So there was a question I just saw. What does the INCUP acronym stand for? Interesting, new, challenging, or creative, urgent, and passion. So something you're passionate about. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay, the next one is, what about feeling overwhelmed with how many tasks are on your mind?
Yeah. That's where the mindfulness can really help. Writing things down, putting those things into your schedule, those things can be really helpful. If we're talking about like dealing with the ruminating thoughts, that's a separate like it really depends on why they're in there and what it is that's really overwhelmed. Are you feeling overwhelmed because there's too many? If that's the case, then we need to talk about like, hey, how can I set boundaries and not take on so much? If it's I'm overwhelmed because like I just can't slow my thoughts down, then maybe that's where we start looking at like, okay, we need to do some mindfulness practices, or maybe we need to look at medication and what that could do for us. Um, so if it's too many things, like how are you keeping track of it? What are you doing to make sure that there's time for it? And are we committing to things that maybe we need to just like pull back on a little bit more and be more realistic about what that looks like? So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay. We'll try to get to as many of these as we can, guys, but I'm scrolling and it currently says I have 49 new comments, so
Yeah, so
we'll
do
see.
I. So,
Right? Okay, so what if your coworkers or boss hate your verbal processing? How can you moderate this?
oh, I am so curious how many people in the chat like super relate to that because like I've had moments. I I would imagine almost every single person with ADHD at some point has been told you talk too much, or like, I need you to stop talking, or like, I don't know, you figure it out on your own. Um, that is really hard. So if it is something that like they can't put up with, think about the timing that you're doing it. Think about like, okay, how much time do I have for this? And it's okay to walk up to your coworker and say, like, I really need to talk through this. Do you have the space for that? And it might be yes, it might be no. So saying to them like, okay, I need to figure this out. And maybe that particular coworker isn't the right person for that day. They're really, really overwhelmed too. It might even just be like, hey, I'm going to talk through this out loud, but I don't want to sound like a crazy person. So you are welcome to just do what you're doing. And I'm just going to talk through this while you listen. Okay. It also just has to do with like understanding that, like, I'm not looking for a solution. I'm not looking for you to solve anything. I just need to be able to talk through this and make sure that I'm on the right track. So that's a helpful thing too, is to help them understand. It's not about like, I don't care if you remember everything I say, because it's not about the process getting to the end point. It's all about like, okay, what does it look like in the end? My husband and I actually have a cue. If I'm telling a story and I'm getting way off the mark, because it happens, I'm pretty sure it's happened in the last hour. He does this. He'll just go like this to me, and then I know, okay, I'm off track. I got to get back on track. Like, it's just our signal, but it's lighthearted, it's funny, and we just like we joke about it. I'll be telling a story about something, and he'll just look at me and go, Beth. Right, back on track. Where was I? What was even the point of the story that I started in the first place? Like, and so it does have a lot of it has to do with just understanding and empathy. So patience. So yeah.
Okay. Someone said, I have a hard time starting and completing a task because it seems so overwhelming and I have no idea where to start, so I just don't start it. Any ideas on this?
Yeah, that is also probably going to take more time than what we have. But the thing to remember is that a person with ADHD, like they're going to see a task a very different way than someone who doesn't have those same executive functioning issues. They're seeing all the steps all at once rather than like a spread out of like, oh, here's the steps that I need to take. And so that's where like writing down the steps that you need to do can be really helpful. Some of the verbal processing can be really helpful. Like, okay, I'm starting this thing and I just need to figure it out. Routine, scheduling, like, okay, so when I go to clean the kitchen, I know this is exactly what I need to do. Um, and so that can be kind of a helpful way to do that as well. Just building in that like really consistent, like this is where I start. Because once we start, usually like it's okay to like keep going, but yeah, it can be hard.
Okay, besides the job accommodation network, do you know of a good website slash book to help figure out how to ask for or and speak to an employer about job accommodations?
Um, I'm not aware of anything like super specific. I think when it comes to job accommodations, it really is just going to depend on the company policies and just like what you feel comfortable disclosing. And make sure if you're disclosing that you are someone that wants those things, that you're involving HR where you can. And you're being thoughtful and mindful about it. Like if it's something that's brand new to you, then maybe hold on to it for a minute. Wait till you're in a calm like headspace and not like in a space where there's chaos happening in your brain, but you're really able to kind of think through it. But I don't know of any. We could talk about that in a separate one too. In fact, I'll make a note of that.
Okay, my question just disappeared. Okay, what's the best way to support an adult child, 19-year-old with ADHD who's struggling to manage it?
So something to keep in mind with ADHD is it actually causes kind of a delay in brain development and maturity in some ways. And so a lot of young adults with ADHD kind of seem a little bit maybe less mature, not always, but can come across as like slightly less mature, having a much harder time kind of launching into adulthood. So some of that changes as they age and their brain actually finally catches up and develops. And some of it too is just, again, like maybe sitting down with them and talking through, give them the space to verbally process. Like, okay, what is it you're struggling with? What's going on right now? And if they're not wanting to talk, it might be because they're feeling some shame about it. So, kind of increasing the connection between the two of you and decreasing the shame coming out of it. It's not about whether they're doing it right or wrong, but just giving them a space to kind of talk through it. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, I'm still scrolling. There's a lot of comments.
Yeah, we're probably not going to get to all of them.
Yeah, I'm actually almost to the bottom.
Okay,
So
great.
hold on, everyone. Awkward silence, awkward silence. Oh, maybe we've got them all. A lot of people just want this to be a series. Like,
That's the plan. That is
yeah.
the plan. So we're for sure going to talk about like what ADHD looks like in kids and in teenagers, and in parenting and in relationships and all those things. So I loved the suggestion of talking specifically about work and like menopause and things like that. So yeah, we'll add some of that as well. We didn't talk about medication very much today, and that was on purpose because that is its own thing. So we'll talk more about that another time. But
Okay,
yeah.
then the next one is what are the best ways to avoid doom scrolling on your phone or the fastest way to stop scrolling? Maybe some tricks of ways to stay off your phone.
Okay, that actually is something that I had in my
How long
notes
is it for
skipped.
event?
So there are apps you can download that have like cutoff points. So like you can put in like at this point, like I can only watch this much on TikTok or social media in general, whatever that is. And at that point, my phone will just like shut off those apps. So that's actually probably the most effective because then like you don't need to be super duper aware. The one that like I have had some clients that have recommended is called shoot, Screen Zen. I haven't used it personally, but I have some clients that do and have really liked it. So that's one that'll just like cut that off. So
Hey, someone asked, how do I get diagnosed? Or should I even try to get diagnosed?
yeah, whether or not you want to is totally up to you. And again, that comes back to do you want to use medication or not? So you can always talk to your doctor about it. Go see a therapist, schedule an assessment with a therapist or a psychologist, psychiatrist, any one of those options, you could do that. So